Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. This is episode 95. In this subject, we are going to talk about, well, I think we'll just jump right into it because there's quite a lot going on here. I am looking forward to my guest. We've been trying to have you on for a while.
Yeah.
Interruptions happen, so let's not let anyone wait any further. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Luke Brown, and I'm really just a normal guy. I've been blessed to work in the firearms industry in the past. I currently run my own media agency, and I'm just a gun guy, and I like to read books. And Forrest and I met, um, 6, 7 months ago now, and had some really good conversations. And he was generous enough to invite me on, and we're gonna hopefully dive into a couple of really good topics surrounding gun culture and the duty of what we should all be about is kind of what I think we want to get into, but really dig into the why of everything. So yeah, that's who I am. I'm really a nobody. I just am a guy who likes to get on and think. I spout opinions online and try to shoot guns accurately somewhat and shoot cameras, and that's who I am.
There's a frighteningly large amount of this gun culture who has both firearms and cameras. Like there's a big correlation there.
It's funny. I've puzzled on this so many times. What is it with gun guys and so many of them, because I get messages I would say I get messages more about cameras than I ever do about guns. Hey, what camera setup should I get? All this, and it's really funny. I've sat. Why is it because guns are like so fun? Is it fun to take pictures of guns, or is it just like are they easily aesthetic? I don't know what it is, but it is true. Like for better or worse, we've got a lot of guys out there with cameras and guns.
You could carry that road down a long series of different paths. Perhaps one of them it's the combination of like gear and accessories and parts and figuring out how to do it, and it's the mechanical nature of it, and it's like trying to learn how to use this thing.
I forget where I read it, but there's actually something to that, because the majority of wedding photographers are women, whereas the majority of product and like automotive photographers, the more technical side of photography, it's much more technical to take product photography, whereas it's much more emotional to take weddings. And so the majority of product is men and the majority of weddings is women. And so it's kind of interesting how that works. I think there is something to that where the guys kind of see, there's this gadget and I can upgrade this and I can do this, and if I put this thing on it, it does that.
Yeah, look at the machining they did on this lever. Isn't that beautiful? And I get it. In some ways, it's just like, oh, dude, it's just a lever. But on the other hand, it's like, have you ever tried to work with a firearm that's got a really bad slide lock?
Yeah.
It's like, why did you do it this way? Why did you machine it this way? This is terrible.
It's the little things in life. It's like, and I don't know. It's somewhat of a curse though, because they're both rather expensive. So at least one of them makes me money.
Yeah, right. And I don't know which one sometimes. Well, before we get so now that we're gonna get into it, as you were talking about it too, in the introduction, I was you brought up this kind of motif, this idea, and I was thinking about it this way: that comes something like this. In the world of both the subject that we're about to talk to and in philosophy in general, there seems to be this challenge, this overwhelming charge that resides in the background. It's kind of like I don't want to say it's an oppressive force, that isn't right, but it's not like a tumor, but there's this sort of haunting weight that exists in the background of philosophy. And when I mean background of philosophy, I mean literally in like the back of one's mind when engaging in philosophy, and that is and I think it was who was it? Robeson brought it up when he was on the show a while ago. CB Robertson. Sorry, dude, I pronounced your name wrong again. But he brought up the whole: is it better to be perceived as wise and not be wise, or is it better to be perceived as a fool or not wise but actually be wise? And it's this idea of like, is this thought genuine? Is my concern into this subject real? Am I actually working with things that are tangible and real, in the sense of, when I'm trying to understand what is right and true and good, am I really in pursuit of what is right and true and good, or am I simply trying to sound like somebody who gives sage advice?
Yes.
And
Or, or
go
or
ahead.
trying to take your preconceived notion or your default view and trying to take twist logic around it and mold logic around it. That's, I think, even more common is when you see guys, they'll have some idea, and then they will, instead of being open to exploring what the counter idea is and then weigh the two fairly, they'll kind of hug onto it. Oh, this is the safety of my own idea.
Yep. You see this, there's actually a really good parallel to this. And one of the things that I'm enjoying about gun culture and philosophy is that there is so many, I have through time seen so many lines between them. And one of the good examples of what you're talking about is when somebody goes out and buys a new X, and suddenly they reorient all of the potential scenarios that they may ever encounter around that thing.
Yeah.
And so they're like, oh, and you see this in different levels, right? You sometimes,
Yeah.
in the most simplest level, you'll be like, you'll look at it on a new gun owner mentality, and that's,
Yeah.
oh, I bought a 45 because it's got more knockdown power, and you're like, yeah, well, that's not actually really how it works.
Yeah.
And they're like, and then and then what they'll do is they'll go out of their way to bend everything to their will, of saying, no, 45 is literally the best round ever. And this
Yeah.
is this is a hyperbole argument, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's like, you missed what I said. I just said it's not really how it works with 45.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean
It's
that you
like
should throw it in the garbage can.
it's like what you said just before we started recording about the night vision, right? It's like guys upgrade from a PVS 14, they buy duals, and then all of a sudden, often they'll wrap up and duals are the only thing. The PVS 14 is garbage. I can't even believe I even own that thing. It's useless, which is not the case, right? There's still many uses for it it exists for a reason.
Okay,
And like,
I need to interrupt you there. I do not. I
yeah,
have never met this person. I have never met a person who was like, PVS 14s are garbage. The only thing that
no, guys who debate. What I'm saying is guys who debate about like, oh, you have to have duals because of that depth perception. Like if you run a PVS 14, it's like you're really, cutting out. And it's true, right? But like guys who say, oh, because I have duals,
Sure,
the
you can
PVS 4.
you can be cool like me.
The
It's a straw
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
I think of it. I think it's a straw man.
It's a straw man. It's a
I
straw
don't know.
man.
I don't know anyone who does this. The only thing that I have is people trying to apologize for 14s, and it's
Oh,
like, you don't need to apologize for them. They're a great unit. There's a reason why most people move up to duels, though. So
exactly,
like,
exactly.
but that's not. It's
Yeah,
here's I'm gonna spoil it out. I wanted to do it in like a mini. I was thinking about putting together like a mini thing on this one, but there's this comparison all the time between like a dual tube pair of night vision. Let's see if I got one over here. So like, there's always this comparison between like a dual tube pair of night vision, which these are DTNVGs, and then like a monocular. So like, this is like a PVS 14 in white by AGM.
yep,
And there's always this comparison, and it's like, okay, so if you're gonna do a comparison between the two, first of all, why? Like, why would you even compare them? Because one is a dual, one is a monocular.
yep,
They're different things, sort of. I mean, whatever, right? And then you have this mentality of like, well, one's just good enough, and one's this, and here's what I think an argument should look like. At the end of the day, for most people who are paying for it themselves, cost matters. Don't lie about it. We all know. I know, it's real. Like,
yep.
it's expensive and it's a big ask. So
It is.
in a world where houses are expensive, night vision is also expensive. Let's not
Yep.
jump the shark here. But even if that's the case, why would you compare a 14 to a pair of DTNVGs or 31 alphas? because
Right.
the price difference is about 8 to 10 grand, depending on models. A more accurate comparison, or sorry, a more reasonable comparison is: do you buy a peak white monocular and a high-end laser, or do you buy a mid-grade pair of duals and work with passive aiming for a while? I think that is a more reasonable comparison,
Much more.
because if you're going to try to start with night vision and you're like, okay, you've made the decision to get into night vision, and you're going back and forth between buying a pair of dual tubes and a monocular, you're considering buying dual tubes. You're going to buy dual tubes.
Yeah.
Unless you're pulling back away from comparing a $10,000 difference between each other, because this isn't cars. This isn't, do you want a Jeep Grand Cherokee, or do you want a, the next version of it, or whatever? It's something more. And so, yeah, I think that's a better comparison. Instead of trying to go, oh, PVS 14 is just perfectly good. It's just like, it's not just as good. It's an extremely capable unit, and comparing it to a pair of dual tubes is not a reasonable thing to do.
Yes.
At all.
Yeah.
They're, so, because like,
yeah, it's true. It's true, and you bring up a good point too with the like being realistic about the cost of that stuff is very important, because we all, I don't know if you know anybody, but there's people who jump into pretty substantial debt to get into some of this stuff, and you kind of sit there scratching your head like, this is not, it kind of goes back to what we're going to get into here is, should people be doing that? Is that really what they should be doing? And there's, when we start throwing around the words, like we're going to throw around the words of like, oh, duties or obligations, or should we, and it kind of, I think sometimes that's used as people say, oh, well, this is an important thing to invest in. You're like, yes, but at the same time, like we're not living in a world where the world is ending. You still have bills to pay tomorrow, and maybe pace yourself. It's there's 23, 24-year-old kids out there who are trying to jump into something, trying to buy duels with try to smack down 10, 12K on something that you're going to use. It's not like they're out there running around every night in it. So it's an interesting debate. This is something that I've debated with friends quite a bit, of where's that balance point where it's like, oh, this is a good thing to do. And obviously, you don't want to, the standard is stay out of debt and all that. But it's interesting that so many guys kind of forego that, where they're kind of responsible in all other areas, but then they'll kind of make this exception where they're like, oh, well, it's an important thing, I'd rather have it, and I'll pay it off. And that's true, you can, but this is that's a whole rabbit hole. Within reason. Within reason. Yeah.
So let's jump into the first subject that we were going to get into, and you brought up some ancient.
Stay on track.
You brought up some ancient literature. Go. Would you present your whole idea?
Yeah. So, kind of I was, you and I had talked several months ago, and then we're both going throughout our lives, and then I made a post a couple months, maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, and it gained quite a bit of traction on, at least for my little page, Instagram page, and it had some messaging in there about how do we change the world, and I'm positing that we, in the gun culture, we kind of look to the gun first, or there's an inclination to look to the gun first as the solution. At least if we were look at where all the energy is put, it's all put into the training of the gun, the wielding of the gun, and that's all fine and good. I do not want to take away from that, but stepping back, we start talking about changing culture, or changing the world at large, and we ask the Second Amendment community, well, would you pick up a gun to solve this problem that we're facing, whether it be a legislation problem or a cultural problem? And the answer is, oh no, that's the last resort. The gun is the last resort. And so my question that I kind of want to posit today, part one, is, well, if the gun is not the first solution, what is the first solution? What should we be looking at, and how do we back up and kind of take a macro view of that? And then secondly, because we have this, we're kind of, because the culture is, because we can't answer that first question, we're kind of left with the second question of, and this is where you said bring up an ancient story of, it reminds me of the story of Odysseus, in that Odysseus is kind of this character who has been away from home, and he's trying to journey back home. And I think he's been through, he's seasoned, he's gained this knowledge of how the world works. He's gone out, he's seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then he, in the Iliad, and then in the Odyssey, he makes this big journey home. And the only thing that carries him to that, to his final destination, the only thing that gets him through is he knows what he's fighting his way back home for. He knows what's waiting for him. And as cringy as it is, that word of being based, right, has kind of lost its meaning, but there's like Odysseus truly was based in a very real sense, in that he had a home base. He had a home to go back to, right? And so what I'm seeing is, without a home base, without knowing what you're truly about on a very rooted level, like deep, we go beyond the first layer. We need to go like 2 or 3 layers deep to really know, okay, what are we doing all of this for? Why would I go as a civilian and take a CQB class, right? Why would veterans share their knowledge with the world? All of this is motivated. It has to be motivated by something. And I think a very common thing is, we get into, guys will say, well, it's for the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment is about, preserving the republic against tyranny. And you say, okay, fair, but why preserve the republic against tyranny, right? And then that's like the second deeper question that we have to get into is, and I think very few people are like, well, tyranny is bad. I'm like, okay, well, great, but why is it my job as a civilian? Why is it my job to do that? Like, and then this is kind of where I kind of want to get into the discussion of this with you is, it's a very American spirit to say, okay, well, it's our job to stop. This is what makes us unique as Americans. We stop, we have these amendments enshrined in our Constitution to stop tyranny from happening. But I feel like the modern man has lost his why, or his direction. There's a very, like, I know you've said this in the back, the Second Amendment culture is very disorganized. And it's kind of why we lose in the cultural sphere, we lose in the legislation sphere, and we lose in our own, sub niches of, there's infighting, and it seems like there's a lack of direction in what are we all about, right? What is this for? And what does the modern, 18 to 35, 40-year-old, military age, I'll say that, military age man in America in 2023 who is interested in getting into firearms training beyond just the, oh, I know how to go hunting. It's like the guys who are already invested, right? Which I think is probably the majority of this podcast's, demographic. What do you, I'd say, if you could leave this podcast with one thing, I just would like everyone to ask themselves, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I'm not saying that as like a challenge of like saying that we shouldn't be doing it. I'm all for it. I mean, look at behind me. I'm very very invested. I'm right there with you guys. But I was just kind of scratching my head the other day of like, okay, well, it's a good question to ask ourselves. It's a good reflection, right? Is it because one of the big quotes that I always remind myself of, I forget who it is. It might be G.K. Chesterton. Um, it's very easy to Google this one, but the true soldier fights not for what he, because he hates what it's in front of him. He fights because he loves what is behind him, and it kind of posits this in an interesting way. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So I've got a couple of things, and I got to go back a little bit.
Yeah, go. We can go all the way back.
We got to go back a little bit. So you started with talking about how an observation that you've made within gun culture is that, given we haven't done like polling or a poll, or we haven't done a
Yeah.
survey, but it can be kind of understood and observed in some sense, which is nice, because then for those it applies to, they can comprehend it, and for those it doesn't, they'll probably be able to observe and say, all right, we're good here. And that
Yep.
is, there's an inclination to jump to the gun as a solution. And my thought on that one was, because I've instructed, I've performed, whatever, and I've done all these different things, right? I've kind of played quite a few of the different gambits when it comes to gun culture, and there was a very prominent micro trend, and it goes something like this: if you ever have to defend yourself, God forbid it ever happen, this is what you do. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
the God forbid this ever happened
Yeah.
statement that people made was very performative. It was like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like have you ever looked into cryptocurrency? I'm not a financial advisor, but have you ever looked at
Exactly.
crypto? And you're like,
Yeah.
I mean, I get what you're saying, dude. You're saying, don't sue me. Here's an
Yeah.
idea. You know what I
It's kind of
mean?
like beating around the bush of why we're even here talking about,
Exactly. And the other
like,
side,
can we just be straight up? We're here to talk about shooting people, like
sure, yeah.
effectively. At a gun class, that's what you're going with. If you're going for a self-defense class, like that's really what you're there for.
So this
But
is not like
that, yeah, that disclaimers.
it's not
Yeah.
intended to be like a spear at some dude. It's that is that in gun culture, I've seen this conversation happen many times. In fact, I've been the person having this conversation many times. I've said it myself, and so there's confession involved in this observation, and that is, we or not we, but I have in the past been able to see myself when I say things like, um all of these things could happen, in paint a scenario and build a world and understand what's going on. But if you and create enough caveats to just get to the point where, like, at the end of the day, we're pulling the trigger, dude. So,
Yeah.
but what I've done is I've spent so much time obfuscating that as if that was the end goal, or creating pseudo conditionalities to try to give myself some sort of moral position, not to say that I'm just saying we should go do the violence kind of thing. There's another way of saying it. It's that, is that, because I think there's a dual, there's a double. It has not two sides to it. It carries two concepts at the same time. One, the very true reality that at the end of this, there is the barrel of a gun.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the Second Amendment, there's the barrel of a gun, and that
Yes.
is, if and that is the we at least in this is gonna at least in demeanor claim that in the event of tyranny, we will use a gun to defend our life.
Yep.
Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to do that,
Nope.
but okay,
Yep.
but that's the that's the problem, that's the humor of the gun control argument. At the end of both ends of the argument is the barrel of a gun. You will either control with a gun, or you will liberty with a gun.
Yep.
So there's the reality of that.
Mm-hmm.
However, because there's the reality of that, and that is solid. It's not really
Yep.
going anywhere because that's what that
It's
tension
concrete.
is.
It's the book. It's the bookends
Yep.
of the second. Yep, and the whole argument. Yep.
It's easy to go straight to there.
Yeah.
But the question is, at what cost? How much ground are you giving up before you're waiting for that thing? And that can be seen as time. Like, okay, well, I'm willing to give up my tax incentives.
Yep.
Okay. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
or I'm willing
Yeah.
to give up the ability to buy a house. I'm willing to
Yeah.
give up this. I'm willing to give up this. But oh, you said I can't have this.
Yep.
I can't have an AR-15 now. We're going to go to war. It's like, okay, that is so it's
Mm-hmm.
hyperbolic. It's over the top. But the point
Yeah.
is that quite a bit of gun culture does deal with that issue. Not quite a bit. That's not the right way of saying it. I see the warning that's baked in the cake, and that is
Yeah.
when, even though it is there, what about everything else? And then the other side of
Mm-hmm.
that translates into is, um, why this? Why is this a wall? And what is that for? And what for?
Yeah.
Defend the republic against tyranny for what reason?
Yep. Yep. Is it? Yeah. Defend the. Yeah, because uh, something that's I think often misunderstood with the Revolutionary War is, the Americans unfortunately have this very basic history knowledge usually, and so if you look at the Revolutionary War and you see it as um, they started a tax on tea, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they started. That's what yeeted it off, right? Exactly. And so, um, like look at when the first shots broke out at Lexington and Concord. What were the British on their way to go do?
Confiscate weapons.
Confiscate weapons. And so that was the camel, that straw that broke the back, or at least that was the event that surrounded the kickoff to it, right? But there had been so much leading up to it, in as far as the representation with Britain, and just the saying, hey, writing letters, appeals, hey, you guys aren't listening to us, and then actions start happening on the ground in the colonies, and all of a sudden it's like, hey guys, this ball's moving, and Britain's not listening. What are we doing? And I don't know, like the it's interesting. Here's a good question that this might take us down a tangent, but if a if you took the young gentlemen from the Revolutionary War and you plopped them into the United States of America, I think they would be so shocked and flabbergasted that so much freedom and ground has been given up, and like having to sit them down and say, no, okay, so back, like the reason that we're all taxed this way is because back in the 30s there was this bill passed that allowed the government to withhold employers to withhold their taxes from paychecks, and it's we can now tax pretty much anything, and people really don't notice because the money never hits their accounts anyway. And all of this, you could sitting down and trying to explain to them, like,
Well, and the tyranny of
here's how they
taxation has
are.
become the tyranny of taxation has become so individualized. So
Yes.
in other words, like, okay, so you and I, at least know 150 people.
Yeah.
You at least have if I gave you an hour, you could probably write 150 names down on a sheet of paper, and so could I, right? And so if any one of those people doesn't pay their taxes, there's no it's boom. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
not AR-15. It's they're getting hit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like, whereas pay your taxes, and you're like, well, the king's not going to know that we didn't sell 900 bushels of tobacco.
Yeah.
So
Because we
here's
still
20.
use
He's on
physical
the other.
currency. Yeah, he's on the other side of the country, and I'm using a physical currency with an actual paper trail.
But we also can't go back to that. It's never going to happen.
It's never going to. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting.
It's a different world.
It is a different world. And okay, so Where were we? We were
On
talking about
we need to get back into Odysseus because I started with.
Odysseus.
So I was following up on what you were saying in regards to maybe I think if you and I are saying the same thing, it's be warned in yourself. Warn yourself against. It's not really warned, but like be warned in
Yeah.
yourself of like
Yeah.
recognize. And I think this is actually a really good writing project. To be clear, is take 30 minutes and a pen and paper and write out that idea of like what are your conditions for violence and what are your conditions and why do you think about it that way, and write down the things that you think that challenge you, because
Yes.
it's very, because I agree with it. It's easy to focus on the big scenario at the end. It's kind of like if you're preparing for a deployment, it's easy to train for the missions and then miss the sustainment,
Yeah.
or the other way around, to be honest.
Yeah.
But so especially with gun culture, it's like I honestly think it's a really good writing project. I've done it
It
myself a
is.
couple times where it's like I sit down and write what are my motivations, and I
Mhm.
try usually set a time limit, and I'm like, okay, I only have to do this for 30 minutes and I have to write down exactly what I think my motivations are. Not what I
Yep.
want my motivations to be, but like, no, I think about in the event that this happens, if I'm slighted in this way, I'll use this or whatever. I think it's a
Exactly.
good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Or yeah, exactly. And it changes too. Like it changes when you're like it changes when your circumstances change, when you as a person change, right?
Yeah.
Your like if you have dependents, that it's going to look drastically different when if you're like I'm a single dude. I
Mhm.
I I will, I'm willing to give up all these other things that a guy with 3 kids would never dream of giving up, right? And so the guy with 3 kids might have a much shorter chain that
I know
he's willing to
I know
yank, you
I
know?
know plenty of men with multiple kids who are fully willing to abandon their children for the sake of a 30-minute adventure.
Yeah, yeah. And
They're willing
it,
to abandon an 18 their children. They won't admit it. I mean, some of them will, but I've met men who are willing to abandon their family for something like that. It's
it
for
it's an
yeah,
interesting. There's an interesting here. This is an interesting one. You remember you've watched The Patriot, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Grew up on it.
There's a great scene in there where they're all debating, right? They're in the courthouse and they're all debating what are we gonna do, um and um some guys are like we should go to war, we should kick it off, and then the others are like, hey, I got family and kids, like really we're gonna do this, and like that means I'm gonna have to leave them, and like that sacrifice becomes and that stress becomes so much higher versus the guys who are more free, quote unquote. um it's interesting because there's the sacrifice of and even the sacrifice of giving up your family. Like I'm recently married, like it's my whole paradigm has shifted from going from a single guy to now married. Like, oh, I have a responsibility that's beyond myself now in my
Yeah,
immediate little sphere, right? I have my own little kingdom to protect, my own household, and that changes versus like, I I rent with 3 roommates. Like what's the worst that can happen? you know, and the chain that you're willing to yank on yourself is a lot shorter. And if you do choose to go, right, the sacrifice is much greater, right? And I think it becomes much greater. The more you have to lose, the more you have to be willing to sacrifice if you really are going to go to that end of the ultimate end that we're talking about, of like the rifle, or even those little incremental steps of like, okay, you know um we're talking, I guess, in the context in this whole conversation of like, should as tyranny encroaches, as it incrementally tends to do, we're kind of in right now, I guess we're having a conversation of where are people willing to draw lines, and your little writing exercise is something that might be helpful for people to do. But like, Is it when they start, levying your wages, or taxing? Because really things are going to would start there, right? Like it's going to start with, okay, if you want to not turn in your guns, we're going to tax you quite a bit, very heavily. We're going to just tax you into oblivion. You're like, okay, are you willing to give up your money? And then once the money's gone, are you willing to give up your business, your house, And then at what point we're kind of having this moral argument of where's that point? Thankfully, and we really don't have to have that conversation in the immediate future, but it's a good thought exercise
Well,
for guys to do, because if we don't think of the bookcases of the why the Second Amendment is rifle over here, right? Rifle and tyranny over here, and we have to kind of think. Everyone is, I think, pushed up against this end of the bookcase and is like, we're thinking over here, but where on here is where the actions in between.
Yeah, so I don't think that people live on that edge. I think, okay, even more specifically, there's a perceived semi-inevitable future in involved in it's a worldview is what it is. It's not quite metaphysics, but it's a bit of a worldview where you have a bit of a story of what you think is going to happen, and we all do this. There's no way to get around having a worldview. You just have one, and if you don't know what yours is, well, you have one, because it's a descriptive term. It's a worldview is how you perceive the world, and some of that includes timeline and telos and goals and objectives and what the future may pass, and so on and so forth. And what I see very often is this idea that there's this statement that says in the future X will happen and we will have to do the thing.
Yep.
Okay, but we're not there yet.
We're not there yet. Yep.
But eventually we'll get there.
Yep.
Okay. When? I don't know.
Right. So
what is the
in the meantime,
what is the condition that you would create that would mean we're there? I don't know. Okay, so what you're saying is that there's a potential future that will happen, but I don't know what it is, and I know what I think it looks like, but I don't know when it'll happen, and I don't know the conditions that could set it into happening, and now I'm externalizing my individual responsibility by saying, well, there's something that's going to happen, and then we're going to have to do a thing, and you're like, okay, that's so vague, it doesn't mean anything, and in reality, it's going to be, yeah, that was yesterday. And now every day is in front of you, right?
Yeah.
And the issue being presented is in some sense, I know if certain things happen, many things change quickly. But so I will say, so you'll see this happening where someone says, well, when they start doing when there's pogroms, or when they start, they recreate the Holodomor, but with religious, whoever they is, right, but with a religious tone to it, or when they do okay, so wait a minute, so like how many people have to be in shallow mass graves before your turn, you're going to be ready? Because I would like to know a number so that when that happens I can call you. This is and that's a hyperbolic way of presenting it, but really it's what is the thing that's you could face, that's a gray enough area where you have to struggle with it, where you're really on the line. And a really good example would be when they start persecuting churches. They closed churches in 2020, and they punished people for going to church, but you could go to a gay bar, or you could protest in the streets. Okay. So
we've been there.
I'm not saying that was an atrocity. I'm saying that they did the thing in a way that you went, oh well, that's okay. Like what, this isn't worth it. And you're like, and to some extent, absolutely. Yeah. What are you going to do? Start burning down Capitol buildings? You're just joining in with the mob.
Exactly. And that's the sinister thing, is this whole discussion can be applied to so many different. Look at the education system and what's being put into schools. Um, that's a very prominent thing in news circles. I'm sure it's on. Everyone has heard about that. It's almost easier to talk about that because there's like a clear thing. We're like, okay, it's a curriculum, it's schools, it's an ideology. Um, there, we could talk about that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But
We should
the same the
probably
same the same thing can be. My point is, without opening a can of worms, the same thing can be applied to. You can ask, okay, well, in the education of your children in their schools, where's the line that you draw in their curriculum? What are you willing to allow in, right? And it's this like, oh, well, I guess we have to be able to put that in and put this in. And it's like these small retreats. And I feel like in the disorganization and the inability to say that is the line, we are disorganized. And with that disorganization comes many small retreats where it seems like the it seems like everyone's trying to figure out what they're about, and in figuring, the longer they figure out what they're about, the more there is small incremental retreats. While you say, oh, well, we have to do this because it kind of makes sense, like, red flag, like people say, and I'm saying we're like full out gun guys, right? The average American who's like, oh, well, I can see a case for red flag laws. Like, I can see how that can actually help someone. And you're like, okay, that you're not thinking through what that means, but you have to kind of, it's a small, like we look at it as like, that's a retreat back. We're taking a step backwards, farther towards the bookshelf. It's one more nudge past. Like, we can see, like, oh, this is the next step, because that's going to lead to this, and down in the future.
sure. I mean, maybe I have an issue of okay, so I could see a case for red. I could see a case for red flag laws. I could see a case
So
for
can I.
no, I can see a case for carpet bombing Chicago. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean
Yeah.
anything. Like, oh, cool. Like, oh,
Exactly.
I don't understand.
Exactly.
Well, that's
It
not an
doesn't.
argument, you know.
Right, but it puts a. You have to be able to say, okay, well, so if it's an argument, but is it an argument where that is, like, is that the line? Okay, if that's not the line, and we're
Yes.
talking again in the registry, is a registry a line? Okay, because back in the day, I mean, it 250, 300 years ago, it would have been unfathomable that you would have to pay King George a tax stamp to suppress your musket, right? And a week's wages too,
Yeah.
and
It's the
like,
hush.
so
It's not called a musket anymore. It's called the hushkit.
yeah, the hush kid. And so, like,
Ah, those damn
what is
rebels
it?
in the swamp with their
Yeah,
hushkits.
yeah, so ungentlemanly of them.
Yeah.
Um, I I don't know. Like, it baffles me that it feels like we have fallen so far from the
So
guys, like our ancestors would not have put up with what, like, how many retreats have happened. And so at a certain point you're asking yourself, well, gee, we're now living in a society where, like, okay, rioting is a fairly foreseeable thing, and civil unrest is, like, we've all thought in the past 2 years, every single person listening to this has thought, what would I do if civil unrest came to my town? Or even worse, they've had civil unrest in their town and they've actually had to deal with it in the moment, and like I did. And you're sitting there saying, okay, it all of a sudden, these questions of where is the line drawn become a lot more tangible and a lot more potently in your face.
yeah,
And so it's an interesting thought experiment, like you said.
hoping
But
for
going
the
back
ap- oh, yeah, I was gonna say hoping for the apocalypse is a really good way to try to assuage your conscience of not doing the thing that you know you're supposed to be doing. Oh,
yes,
I can't focus
that
on
goes
building a
that goes
responsible
back
life. Yep.
that goes back to Odysseus, where, like, Odysseus, when he was asked to leave for the war, was reluctant, right? Because his life was good. he's sitting there with his vineyards and his wife and his son, his newborn baby son. He doesn't want to leave that. And so it took the oath that he had sworn to his king to say, okay, I have to fulfill my word. This is like, it's an on your honor thing. I got to go. And off he went. It's an interesting thing how many guys nowadays would, with, you know, oh, I've built a business, I have a house, I've got my cars, I've got my guns, I'm happy, maybe I have some acreage out in the country, I'm doing well for myself, right? Where is it like, and I'm not saying like where you suit up and you're like, I'm putting on musket and powder horn and I am leaving to go fight the tyrants. Like, no, but where is it where I am willing to go to my local town hall meeting, right? It's harder, I think, to get guys to go to their local town hall meeting than it is for them to go sign up for a CQB class. And that is such an alarming civics problem. When and there's a certain amount of guys who will say, well, civics don't really matter. Like the system's corrupt. You're like, well, you know what? We live in it's a human system. There will be corruption. It's still a system, and I'm not saying, I don't want to come on here and say like we have to look to politics as the solution. But what I'm saying is the 2A community is so focused, so hyperfixated on, and I'm on the gun. And I'm saying where, like, again, going back to Fred, like on his recent podcast about like, there's no honor in war. Like the honor doesn't come from that. And so if like, okay, well, we want to avoid this horrible thing. And
that's a subject that I need to follow up with him on, because it's taken quite a bit of time to think through. And war doesn't bring honor, but war brings circumstances where men can be honorable.
Yes. Yeah, this is true. Courage and honor definitely come from war. Courage and honor also come from doing the small and mundane of everyday life too.
Yes.
And we can all be, we can all kind of, I think, sit in the mundanity of life and wish for, oh, I wish I could do this great and noble thing. And I think in some ways, the whole gun to a training, oh, I'm going to go take a CQB class, it kind of tickles that fancy, right? Whereas maybe we slow down and we say, oh, I have focused on being well-read, or I've focused on, knowing my neighbors, or I focused on actually building a community, right? And like the wealth that gives you and the security that gives you is so underrated, that it's just kind of alarming to see. Like our whole conversation was kind of circling around this topic of a lack of grounding in the why, and a lack of being able to pinpoint. If you take on an aggregate of the aggregated Second Amendment person, and you ask them, where is your line? What are you about? And why are you doing what you're doing? We're saying, on general, that person is going to say, well, in the last 5 to 10 years, I've gotten a lot more serious about training with guns. I've changed my opinions on things like body armor and owning it, or I've changed my opinions on how much armament I should have, or how much skill level I should have. And you're like, okay, great, that's good. And it's understandable because the world's gotten a lot crazier in the last 5 to 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a good thing that you've done that. But really, can you answer why? And it's like, okay, the world is crazy. Fair enough. That's a really good why, and it's understandable. But the world hasn't gotten crazy enough for war, and so where are we? How much energy are we going to put into the machinations of war
I I don't
versus
I don't think your ability to perceive that the world is crazy is really a sufficient why. It's at best a conditional why, and it's a short-term one.
sure,
I think it's
sure,
at best a
yeah,
short-term one in the sense of, well, the reasonable, or sorry, the justification you have for being capable is entirely determined on your ability to perceive a supposed threat. And if, as long as you can't, it effectively justifies disarmament through a lack of perception. And I think there's more to it, but it also brings up the point of when you're talking about this why question over and over again. There's, I will say this much. I believe that most of the gun culture is actively seeking out questions like this.
yeah,
I think that's a good thing. I don't
it
want to
is,
be I don't want to be the guy. I don't believe that. I know there are plenty of examples. You can go out on the internet and find people who are only interested in doing the thing, and fine, you know what I mean?
yeah,
But I do believe that there are that the this is a real question that many people within gun culture are trying to look for and trying to figure out how to answer for themselves. It's part of growing up. It's part of being an individual.
yeah,
And that's a hard thing to do in the 21st century. And because gun culture is another microcosm of Western culture, it's undergoing this difficulty
right,
right now.
right,
However, here's the question:
yeah,
so you get your apocalypse, and you have to go do your revolution or whatever it is.
yeah,
What for? What are you going to do afterwards?
right. What, what are you gonna try? What will you go pick up out of the ashes when the ashes have all settled? Like, what are you gonna say? Oh, actually, that was a good thing, and that was a good thing, right?
Yeah,
You
I
know, like
mean,
I would say it's a family, community, and a faith, right? Those are
mhm.
kind of a three basic pillars. You'd want to some sort of you'd want some sort of of a government, right? You would want the basic things of life, but um, really, like you said, in today's world, everything is so individualized. I think that is part of the problem, in that we've lost the sense of community. Like, it's hard to, when you don't really know your neighbor or you don't relate to your neighbor, how would you be willing to A, band together with them, or B, um, you know, die for them ultimately, right? Like that, because that, when you pick, if the apocalypse comes, that's a likely outcome. And so you see, how do we how do we tell guys, hey, this is all well and good. The rifle is it's a good thing to be good at, but it is the last thing to be good at.
well, how do
And
you tell yourself that?
for me, I see, so I approach it from a a view of this. If I'm commanded to thou shalt not kill, that does not mean I should never kill. It means that, it's an interesting thing with it means that you should not kill unjustly, right? You should not murder is a more accurate way to say it. And so, um, so if you base your view off of that, okay, that's my last, it's my last, that's the last ultimate, um, apocalypse scenario, right? Well, now it's in everything that I do is now ordered to avoid that situation up until there is no place left to turn but violence, right? And so, um, if that means, okay, I can I can build a community with my neighbors where we can keep our our locality safe, right? With in an organized fashion. That is a noble thing to do. I can live in an area where, like, I've up and moved across the country in the last 2 years to avoid violent areas. And I think, and it's a moving thing, like so many friends and family of mine have gone up and they're up and moving from out of these big cities, right? The Chicagos, the New York cities, the Minneapolises. And so going back to your question, how do I answer it? Well, I answer it by it's really, it sounds kind of anticlimactic, but you avoid and you avoid and you strategize and you avoid the end, but you do it in a way not of a cowering, right? It's like you do it because you know the consequences. I have so much that I love in life, right? To the thought of having to pick up a gun and what that would mean to my family, my friends, my neighbors, like, that is such a horrible thought, right? And and I think for Odysseus it's a horrible thought, right? But what happened, like, if you don't have anything to give up, if you don't have anything to fight for, it seems like it would be so much easier for you to jump into armed conflict. Like, the threshold is so much lower if you're like, you know what, screw it. And maybe that's why maybe that's why the 18-year-old men are the ones that we send to war. But so maybe I'm just an old fart, but the horror of war, the horror of violence on another human being is so foreign to the 21st century human, that or at least American, that it seems like
It's
that
also
it's something
addicting.
yes.
Like
I
it's
mean, trust me,
addicting.
I have 5 brothers, and growing up, it was fun to box them and punch them around. And
Yeah, but
but
I guess
like
even in
it
that sense, like it's war is attractive in its own right,
it
but
yes,
war is hard for us to
it's
quantify in 2023.
this is also true. Yeah, I don't know if I did a good job answering that, but it's a hard that this whole conversation that we're having is very hard. And I guess the question, like, are we on the same page, summarizing, like, the why of why, the answering the why of the Second Amendment in the in between areas of apocalypse tyranny on this end, and everything is perfect and right in the world here. And as the needle starts pushing towards apocalypse and tyranny, you see a need to be able to answer for the why of why you would pick up arms at that end of apocalypse and tyranny, or say, oh, I pick up arms here, or I pick up arms here. And
And
it's
what that
it's
would entail, and yeah, I mean that's a hard
and what
question to
that
have, but it is.
it's very hard, and it's one that, like,
Like you can fantasize all day about fighting the politicians, but like that's not
exactly,
a
but
but
you're not
that's
going to be fighting. You're not going to.
I think deep down we all know
It's
that's just
deep
not how it
down.
works though.
Yes, but so that is so much. Okay, so why? why are we running around? If I'm not going to go fight, if that's not the way it works, then why do we have Joe Johnson, going and taking a CKB class, you know, in it's is that just scratching the fantasy itch of war? I don't know. Like, is CQ? Here's an interesting question: is a CQ is taking in, here we are in the relative safety of the world with, yes, there's been we've had protests, we've had rioting, and there's a war happening on the other side of the world. But do you as an American need to go take a CQB class? Or is that scratching a fantasized itch? Or is that saying, no, I see the way that the world is going into a dark direction and I am prudently preparing? Or have we, like, I don't know. Is it
This
because I'm
is why I
sure,
don't. This is why I don't like using need as a justification for making such decisions. I do not like need. It's
I
not a
don't like
good.
need either.
It's not a good. It really no. It's so
Yeah,
insufficient. No one can
yeah,
like because if I say I need it and you say you don't need it, well then screw you. You can't tell me
exactly.
what I need.
Exactly.
And I see things differently, and you don't. You're not realistic, and I'm just a cynic, and all this, and it never ends.
Yep. It
Um,
never ends. It never ends. And
and
that's why the Second Amendment exists ultimately, is like it, because the government could very easily say, oh, you don't need that. Here, I'll take that. And
I'm not sure if I agree with you there. Let me think about it. So the Second Amendment exists as a stopgap for the government to say you don't need something.
no, the stop. No, 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 no. But it.
Okay.
Okay.
I make sure.
The no, 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 no. The Second Amendment exists as our enshrined right to stop tyranny, right? And all the that's a very umbrella thing. Within that umbrella is also protected, would be like the government can't tell you you don't need that, right?
I
So
think what I
in a
think.
way,
Yeah, I mean,
go
what I
ahead.
think the Second Amendment it does is what I think the Second Amendment is it's a statement against slavery. I honestly I think it's a statement of
Yeah.
sovereignty. If you
Yes.
if you do not have if a government, a governing person, elected or otherwise, believes that you do not have a right, treats you as if you do not have a right to privacy, and a
Hmm.
government does not treats you as if you do not have a right to property. They view you as their property, whether or not they're willing to admit it, and by the existence of possessing a firearm. It's not in on the one hand, the Second Amendment informs the government what they're not supposed to be able to do.
Yeah.
But you put enough people in the experiment, and someone's going to step across that line. The thing about it is, there is no way to make the Second Amendment secure except through constant vigilance, which
Constant
sounds
vigilance. Yep.
miserable because you're like, I just want this to be over with. It's the meme.
Right.
Oh, why, women with a time machine. I'm your grandmother. Men with a time machine.
I see what you're saying. I
Right.
see what you're saying. I
But
see
you're
what you're saying. But because, so in that way, you could argue that, yes, of course, we, like, I I I go, I take these classes, I have the equipment, I train, and that's part of my vigilance, right? It's the price we pay for freedom. That's, I mean,
it
we can
doesn't.
kind of tidy it up and wrap it up like that. And like, I do this, and it is the price. Like, why take a CQB class? It's the price I pay in vigilance of my freedoms.
That and it's responsible. It's there's two sides to it. I think there's a positive argument for the existence of morality in the sense of you train so that you will not do evil. I learn how you teach a child how to use a firearm so that they
Yep.
don't do. There's a story. I have a story that when I was a kid, my dad had a sword on the wall,
Hmm.
and I was a small child, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And as I grew up, I realized it was just kind of a showpiece.
Hmm.
But it was a neat thing, right? It was this kind of thing that he had on the wall, and I was like, oh, that's really
Yeah.
cool. And as I grew older, and I was allowed to hold it every once in a while, given I'm like
Yeah.
five or six, right?
Yeah.
And at one point in time, my parents were doing some remodeling, and so the sword was not on the wall. It was like basically under a bed of sorts.
Yeah. Yep.
You know what I mean? And yeah, but it was under kind of a couch bed thing, whatever. And it was under a
Yep.
piece of furniture because they were remodeling this other part of the room. And the neighbor boy had come over, and
Yeah.
I wanted to show him this sword.
The sword.
And because you're like 7 years old, it's the coolest thing in the
Yeah.
world, you know. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, you got to see this, right? And so we scamper upstairs, and I pull out the sword. I'm like, isn't it cool? And he goes, yeah, yeah. Can I hold it? And so I give it to him, and the first thing he does is he takes it and he stabs the couch.
Yep.
Either that or my parents' bed. I can't remember, but it was just like,
It must be a boys thing because my younger brother got his first pocket knife
yep,
the same day he got his first pocket knife. He's sitting in the backseat of the car and cuts this huge gash in the backseat of the car.
yeah. Intrusive thoughts is the thing.
Yeah, the intrusive thoughts one, and it's like but like okay, so now
So
it goes to show if you're like no, okay, he didn't know how to use the sword, didn't know how to use the pocket knife. Okay, teach how to use the pocket knife, show him the capability of here's what a pocket knife can do used
mhm,
wrongly,
mhm.
right? And like it's a valuable lesson. Like my brother learned a valuable lesson when he cut the car seat that day.
Yep.
And um same thing goes for firearms, right? Where we can say, okay, well, you know, learning by learning the capability and learning my capabilities with a firearm, I am now more responsible, inherently more responsible because I know it, right? Like I know it inside and out. I know my capabilities with it. And that's a lot different than just saying, "Oh, it's under the bed," right? And um,
There is a
the
moral
way that
imperative. Yeah, there's a moral
yes,
imperative attached to it in the
hundred
sense
percent,
of
I 100% agree with you. We're on the same page with all of that. I guess what we're still trying to flesh out is the is that line, and it's that hard question of saying what is worth going to war for?
that's a good question to end the first half of this on. We're gonna do let's wrap it up for part
Yeah.
one, and then
Okay.
let's get ready for part two.
Sounds good.
So, Luke, where do people find you? What's
Uh,
the best way to follow you? Where's the where?
yeah.
Let's do the as was it Jack Posobiec says. What are your coordinates? Well,
My
I'm at
coordinates.
29.3745 west to like
No, yeah.
here's my 10-digit
So
grid.
I'm Southpaw Luke across all the platforms. And Southpaw Visuals is my business where I just do photo and video work for people. But outside of that, you can find me on Instagram at Southpaw Luke. Um, and yeah, I'm gonna I'll probably do some stuff on my page, kind of asking people about this and talking about it because it's a fascinating question of asking that why. But um, I really appreciate you having us on this long kind of rambling conversation. It's the rambling ones are the good ones where hopefully we can get to an end
Oh, but we're not
for
done.
part two.
I'm
Oh, we're
just
not done. I
I'm
know.
just I'm just breaking these in half because I need to.
I know.
So,
Same.
you know.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we'll continue this in a part two.
Cool. Well, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. You're listening to episode 95. This is the conclusion of part 1 with Luke or Southpaw Luke Brown, photographer, philosopher, and husband extraordinaire. Now, congratulations
Yes.
on
Thank you, sir.
the good news, and well, maybe congratulations.
Thank you.
From one
Thank
married
you.
man to another. I hope the best for you and yours.
Thank you.
For those who are
It's been wonderful.
listening, yeah, so for those who are listening who want to jump into the conversation, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That is where I am hosting discussions on the topics that we bring up on the show. Since this is episode 95, episode 94 is Meditations on Evil, and that I'm sure will elicit more than a few conversations going on. But if you're listening to this in retrospect later, I really do appreciate the time that you spent with us thinking about what we believe to be right and true and good, both as individuals and as people within gun culture and as people within this country and within this world. If we want to talk about community, part of that is talking to one another. So here's one place where it happens. If you leave a like, if you leave comments down below, I really do appreciate it. It does give us that little bit of lift that keeps the mechanism going. The Redacted Culture Cast is a machine that I hope continues to roll on. So, that being the case, we'll talk to you later. Keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.